You never really think it's going to happen to you. You spend your whole life building a foundation, brick by brick, thinking that if you work hard enough and play by the rules, the walls will stay up. But there I was, 62 years old, sitting in the driver's seat of my old Ford, staring at the neon sign of a 24-hour diner and wondering how my entire world had turned into a pile of ash in less than 90 days. The air inside the car was thick with the smell of cheap fast food and that musty, stale odor that comes from living out of a vehicle. I had exactly $7.38 left in my pocket, just enough for a coffee and maybe a basic burger if I watched the tax. I closed my eyes and could still see my old office. It was on the 15th floor of a downtown building, with a view that made me feel like I'd finally made it. I had spent 35 years building Miller Builders, from a single toolbox and a used truck into a premier construction firm. But then came the Lawson project. It was supposed to be my legacy, a massive residential complex on the edge of the city. Instead, it was my coffin. The soil shifted in a way no surveyor had predicted. The foundation cracked, and the lawsuits started flying like vultures. My insurance company, the people I'd paid faithfully for 3 decades, found a tiny technicality in the fine print to deny my claim. Just like that, I was staring down a $2 million judgment. The bank didn't care about my history of perfect payments or the fact that I'd never been a day late on my mortgage in 20 years. To them, I was just a red line on a spreadsheet. They took the business, then they took the house. I managed to scrape together a few $1,000s by selling off my remaining tools and equipment, but in the world of debt, a few thousand is like a drop of water in a desert. Between rent, food, and the basic costs of survival, that money vanished faster than I could track it. That's how I ended up on my son Liam's doorstep on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a single suitcase and the tattered remains of my dignity. Liam lived in a beautiful colonial house in the suburbs, the exact kind of home I'd always dreamed of providing for him when he was a kid. His wife, Vanessa, had expensive taste, and you could see it in every perfectly trimmed hedge and every designer piece of furniture visible through the windows. When Liam opened the door, he looked startled, even though I'd called him earlier that morning. I tried to keep my voice steady, tried to hide the fact that my hands were shaking as I held the handle of my suitcase. I was hoping I could stay for a few days, I told him. Just until I get my feet under me. I won't be any trouble. Before he could even respond, Vanessa appeared behind him. I'd never been her favorite person, but the look she gave me that day wasn't just cold. It was disgusted. She crossed her arms, and I watched Liam's posture change immediately. He had always been a good kid, but he'd learned to read his wife's moods like a sailor reads the clouds. Arthur, Vanessa said, and my name sounded like a chore she didn't want to finish. Liam told me about the situation. But the thing is, we have guests coming this weekend. You know how small our spare room is. We both knew that the guests were a couple who lived 20 minutes away and never stayed overnight. I looked at Liam, waiting for him to say something, anything, to stand up for his old man. Instead, he looked at his shoes. Maybe there's a motel nearby, he muttered, finally looking up but still refusing to meet my eyes. Something temporary, just until you figure things out. Standing there on that pristine porch, I felt something inside me break that had nothing to do with money. This was the boy I'd taught to ride a bike. The boy I'd worked double shifts for so he could go to the best college without a cent of debt. Vanessa's expression softened into a fake, practiced sympathy. It's not that we don't want to help, Walter. It's just that we barely have the emotional bandwidth to handle our own problems right now. Emotional bandwidth. I wondered when caring for your own father became something that required an internet connection. Liam mentioned a hotel down the road that was $95 a night. Money he knew I didn't have. That sounds perfect, I lied, just to end the humiliation. Vanessa brightened up instantly, the way people do when they've successfully dodged an uncomfortable responsibility. Once you're settled somewhere permanent, we'd love to have you over for dinner, she said. Maybe next month. Next month, when my presence would be limited to a few hours and a free meal. I hugged Liam goodbye. For a second, he held on a little longer than usual, and I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd change his mind. But then he patted my back and said, "Take care of yourself, Dad." I walked back to my car, and the sound of their front door clicking shut felt like a gavel hitting a bench. It was final. I sat in their driveway for a few minutes watching the house. The lawn was perfect, the flowers arranged with magazine precision. Through the window, I could see Vanessa moving around, probably already forgetting I'd ever been there. I tried every budget motel in the area, but there was some kind of convention in town, and every single room was booked solid. By 8 p.m., I was parked behind that 24-hour diner, trying to figure out how to sleep in a Ford sedan without looking like a vagrant. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. I'd spent my whole life building homes for other people, and now I didn't have a single square foot to call my own. That's when my phone started vibrating in the cup holder. It was a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but when you have nothing, you start answering calls you'd otherwise ignore. Arthur Miller? The voice on the other end was formal, precise. Speaking, I said, shifting my weight to get comfortable against the worn upholstery. My name is Julian Vance. I'm calling on behalf of my employer, Mr. Elias Thorne, the man said. He would very much like to meet with you tomorrow morning. It's quite urgent. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. In 35 years of construction, you meet thousands of people, but Elias Thorne wasn't one of them. I told him he must have the wrong person, but the man was insistent. He read out my full name, my birth date, and the fact that I used to own Miller Builders. My stomach tightened. How did a stranger know so much about my life? Mr. Thorne is prepared to compensate you for your time, Vance continued. Would $500 be sufficient for a 1-hour meeting? $500. It was more than I'd seen in weeks. I thought about my $7.38 and the cold night ahead of me. I'll be there, I said. After hanging up, I sat in the dark, staring at the screen. The whole thing felt like a dream or a prank. Rich strangers didn't just call up failed contractors and offer them money to talk. But then again, a week ago, I wouldn't have believed I'd be sleeping in my car, either. The address came through a few minutes later, 37 Elm Ridge Drive. It was in Millbrook Heights, the kind of neighborhood where the houses started at $2 million and went up from there. I tried to sleep, but the seats weren't made for a man my size. Every time I drifted off, the headlights of a car pulling into the diner would sweep across the dashboard, waking me up. I spent the night staring at the ceiling of the car, wondering what kind of man pays $500 for an hour of a stranger's time. Morning in a car doesn't feel like morning. It feels like an ending. I woke up at dawn, my back screaming from the way the Ford seats dug into my spine. Every joint in my 62-year-old body felt like it had been rusted shut overnight. I spent a good 20 minutes just trying to stretch my legs without kicking the dashboard. When I finally dragged myself out, I headed straight for the diner's bathroom. The man staring back at me in the cracked mirror looked like a ghost of the guy who owned Miller Builders just 3 months ago. My gray hair was a mess. My eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and I had that permanent tired look that comes from realizing your own son doesn't have a place for you. I splashed cold water on my face and combed my hair with my fingers, trying to look like someone who deserved a $500 meeting instead of someone who just slept in a parking lot. As I drove toward Oak Ridge, the neighborhood where the meeting was supposed to take place, the houses began to change. They shifted from the comfortable suburban homes like Liam's to massive, sprawling estates that looked more like castles than residences. I checked my GPS again, convinced I had the wrong address, but it led me straight to a set of electronic iron gates. The gates were imposing, decorated with intricate falcon emblems worked into the metalwork. Before I could even reach for the intercom, a voice crackled through the speaker. Mr. Miller, please proceed to the main house. The driveway wasn't just a path. It was a winding road through a private park. Ancient oak trees stood like sentinels on either side, their branches meeting overhead to form a natural tunnel of gold and orange leaves. When the house finally came into view, it took my breath away. It was a masterpiece of colonial architecture with modern glass touches. Probably 20,000 square feet of stone and timber sitting on grounds that seemed to go on forever. I parked my battered Ford between a pristine Mercedes and a sleek BMW, feeling like a skateboard at a luxury car show. Julian Vance met me at the front door. He was exactly as he sounded on the phone. Tall, thin, and impeccably dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than my entire truck used to. He offered a firm, brief handshake and led me inside. Walking through that house felt like walking through a museum. Persian rugs covered floors that gleamed like mirrors. Heavy gold frames held oil paintings that looked like they belonged in a gallery, and every piece of furniture looked handcrafted. It was the kind of wealth that didn't just talk. It whispered. We reached a set of heavy mahogany doors, and Vance pushed them open. The study was smaller than the other rooms but somehow more intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were packed with leather-bound volumes, and the air smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. At the center of the room, behind a massive desk, sat a man in a wheelchair. Elias Thorne looked incredibly frail. His skin was pale and papery, his hands trembling slightly where they rested on his lap. But his eyes, those were different. They were sharp, alert, and they studied me with an intensity that made me feel like he was reading my life story. "Arthur Miller," he said, and his voice was surprisingly strong for a man who looked so ill. "Please sit." I took the chair across from him, feeling my heavy work boots sink into his expensive rug. "I imagine you're wondering why I've asked you here," he continued. The thought had crossed my mind, I admitted, trying to stay professional despite the surreal surroundings. Elias smiled, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition maybe, or deep-seated sadness. "Tell me, Arthur," he said, leaning forward as much as his strength allowed. "Do you remember a rainy night 8 years ago? November 14th, to be exact. Highway 42, just outside of Oak Ridge." My blood went cold. I hadn't thought about that night in years, or rather, I'd spent 8 years trying not to think about it. But suddenly, I was right back there. I could hear the rain pounding on my windshield and see the headlights coming at me in the wrong lane. "How do you know about that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Elias folded his pale hands on the desk. "Because, Arthur, I was in the other car." The words hit me like a physical punch to the gut. I gripped the arms of the chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. The memories I'd buried started flooding back in vivid, terrifying detail. The screech of brakes, the sickening sound of metal crumpling against metal. "The BMW that went through the guardrail," I said, the realization settling in. Elias nodded slowly. "That was me." I remembered it so clearly now. I'd been driving home from a job site, exhausted after a 14-hour day trying to finish a kitchen renovation. The rain had been relentless since sunset. Highway 42 was a nightmare in that weather. All sharp curves and steep drops. I was coming around the bend near Miller's Creek when I saw him. He was hydroplaning, completely out of control, heading straight for my front bumper. "You swerved," Elias said quietly, watching my reaction. "You could have stayed in your lane. The impact would have been head-on, but your truck was heavy. I would have taken all the damage. Instead, you yanked the wheel and went straight into the guardrail. It hadn't been a conscious choice. It was pure instinct. I didn't want to kill the man in front of me, so I sent my own truck into a skid that smashed me into the metal barrier." "You went through the rail," I said softly, the memory of the splash below still haunting me. "Down into the creek. 20 feet down," Elias confirmed. The car landed upside down in the water. I was knocked unconscious immediately. I closed my eyes and could see the headlights pointing up through the dark, murky water of the creek. After my truck had stopped, I climbed out, dazed, and seen his car sinking. "You climbed down," Elias continued, his voice thick with emotion. "The embankment was mud and rocks. You fell twice, but you didn't stop. By the time you reached me, the cabin was filling with freezing water. The details were sharp now. The BMW was crumpled like a soda can. The driver's side was submerged, and the door was jammed tight. I had to break the window with a rock," I whispered, looking down at the faint scars on my hands. "I cut myself pretty bad pulling you out through the glass." Elias reached out and tapped a folder on his desk. "The doctor said that if I'd been in that water for another 3 minutes, I wouldn't have made it. You saved my life, Arthur." I shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done it." Elias let out a bitter, dry laugh. Would they? The police report said 3 other cars passed by while I was in that creek. 3 people saw my lights in the water and just kept driving. But you stayed. You rode with me to the hospital. You stayed until my wife arrived. And then, you just vanished. He looked at me with a mix of wonder and frustration. Why didn't you ever contact me? You never called, never asked for a cent, never even checked to see who I was. I shrugged. It wasn't about the money back then. It wasn't my business. I told him. You were alive. That was the point. I figured you had your own life to get back to. My own life, Elias repeated, and his voice took on a dark, heavy tone. Do you know what I was doing that night, Arthur? Why I was driving like a madman in a storm? I shook my head. I was running away, he confessed. I just found out my company was about to be investigated for fraud, violations that could have put me behind bars for 20 years. I was panicked, terrified, and I was driving to the airport to leave the country forever. The room fell silent, the only sound being the steady ticking of a clock on the wall. That accident changed everything, Elias said. While I was in the hospital, I had time to think. My lawyers managed to clean up the mess, and the charges eventually dropped. But I realized I'd been given a second chance, one I didn't deserve. He tapped the thick manila folder again. I built this entire empire because of that night, Arthur. Because you gave me the chance to make things right. Thorn Industries is worth over $750 million today, and every cent of it exists because you pulled me out of that water. My head was spinning. This man was worth hundreds of millions, and he was crediting me for it? I don't understand why you're telling me this now. Elias opened the folder and spread several legal documents across the mahogany desk. Because I'm dying, Arthur. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 2 months, maybe 3. And before I go, I need to settle my debts. He pushed a document toward me. I couldn't understand all the legal jargon, but the numbers at the bottom had more zeros than I'd ever seen in my life. This is my will, Elias said firmly. As of yesterday, you are the sole beneficiary of my entire estate. I sat there staring at the legal document, the ink blurring before my eyes. My brain simply refused to process the words, sole beneficiary. It felt like the air in the study had suddenly become too thin to breathe. Just yesterday, I was counting pennies for a burger. And now, a man I hadn't seen in 8 years was telling me I was the heir to a fortune I couldn't even fathom. Everything. I finally managed to whisper, my voice cracking. The house, the business, the investments. All of it? This is impossible. You have a family, Elias. You have children. Elias's expression, which had been soft for a moment, suddenly turned as hard as granite. He leaned back in his wheelchair, his eyes flashing with a cold, sharp anger. I have a son who hasn't spoken a word to me in 5 years, he said, his voice dripping with bitterness. He's just waiting for me to take my last breath, so he can use my hard-earned money to fuel his gambling habits and his wife's obsession with designer labels. And I have a daughter who calls me exactly twice a year, on my birthday and Christmas. And even then, it's only to ask for a wire transfer to cover her latest emergency. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze unwavering. Neither of them was in that freezing creek 8 years ago, Arthur. Neither of them risked their life to pull a stranger out of a sinking car. I tried to push the papers back toward him, my hands shaking. I can't accept this, Elias. What I did that night, it was just what any decent person would do. It doesn't deserve this kind of reward. You don't have a choice, Elias interrupted firmly, the authority of a man who had built empires returning to his voice. The papers are filed. The lawyers have been paid. When I'm gone, it all becomes yours. And you say anyone would have done the same? Let me tell you something, Arthur. The police report from that night noted that 3 other cars passed by while I was drowning. 3 people saw my headlights under the water and kept driving. You were the only one who stopped. He paused, a faint smile touching his lips as he looked at me. Do you know what I remember most about that night? It wasn't just you pulling me out. It was what happened after. You were soaking wet, shivering in the October wind, and your hands were bleeding from the glass you'd broken to get to me. But you took off your own jacket and wrapped it around me to keep me warm. You sat with me in the mud and the rain until the ambulance arrived, holding my head up so the water wouldn't get in my mouth. I had actually forgotten about the jacket. It was just an old work coat, but in that moment, it was all I had to give. You didn't know if I was a billionaire or a beggar, Elias said quietly. You treated me like my life had value because I was a human being. In 35 years of business, dealing with thousands of people, you were the only person who ever showed me genuine kindness without wanting a single thing in return. He reached into a side drawer of his desk and pulled out a thick, heavy folder. My name was written on the tab in neat, professional handwriting. There's something else, Arthur. Something you need to know before you make any decisions about how to handle your family. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. What is that? I've been keeping track of you, Elias admitted. Not in a creepy way, but I wanted to make sure the man who saved my life was doing okay. I hired a private investigator to do periodic checks over the years. I know about the lawsuit. I know about Miller Builders collapsing. I know you lost your house. He opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs. They were surveillance shots taken from a distance. There I was, standing on Liam's doorstep with my suitcase. There was Vanessa's cold face in the window, and there was the shot of me walking back to my car, looking defeated, after they turned me away. I also know exactly what they said to you, Elias added grimly. How could you possibly know that? I asked, the blood draining from my face. Elias didn't answer directly. Instead, he pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. The room was suddenly filled with Vanessa's voice, crystal clear and dripping with that fake, sympathetic tone that had made me feel like a burden. Asterisk. It's not that we don't want to help, Arthur. It's just that this is such a difficult time for everyone. We barely have the emotional bandwidth to handle our own problems, Star. Then came Liam's voice. Weak, hesitant, and utterly disappointing. Asterisk, maybe there's a motel nearby. Something temporary until you figure things out, Star. Hearing it again was worse than living it the first time. Felt like a fresh wound. These were the people I had supported for decades, the son I had co-signed a mortgage for, and they were treating me like a piece of unwanted luggage. There's more, Elias said, clicking the recorder off before the conversation continued. Conversations they had after you left, about how relieved they were that you didn't push them to stay, about how they'd been dreading the day you'd finally come asking for help. I felt sick to my stomach. Why are you showing me this? To humiliate me? No, Elias said gently. To protect you. You need to understand who these people really are before you become the owner of an $800 million estate. Because once the world finds out you're wealthy, their emotional bandwidth is going to expand very quickly. He pulled out another document, this one a financial report on Liam. Your son is drowning, Arthur. He owes $43,000 in credit card debt. Vanessa has a shopping addiction they've been hiding for years, spending more on clothes in a month than most people make in a year. Their mortgage is underwater, and they are 3 months behind on payments. They are facing foreclosure within 6 months. I stared at the numbers on the spreadsheet. But Liam said business was good. He told me he got a promotion. The promotion came with an $8,000 raise, Elias countered. In that same year, Vanessa's spending increased by $30,000. They are broke, Arthur. Worse than broke. They are desperate. Then why wouldn't they let me in? I asked, my heart breaking for the son who was clearly living a lie. If they knew what it was like to struggle, why wouldn't they help their own father? Elias gave me a sad, knowing look. Because admitting they had financial problems would have meant admitting Vanessa was wrong. And in that house, she is never wrong. It was easier to paint you as the irresponsible one, the father who should have planned better for retirement. It made them feel superior to you, even while they were sinking into the same hole. I buried my face in my hands, thinking of the 35 years I'd spent being a good father, putting Liam's needs before my own, working extra hours to pay for his wedding and his first apartment. All of it had been erased by a woman who saw me as competition for her husband's loyalty, and a son who didn't have the spine to stand up for his own blood. Walter, Elias said, calling me by the name he'd first seen in the police report. "I'm dying very soon. And when my will becomes public, your family is going to come to you with tears in their eyes. They'll tell you how sorry they are, how it was all a big misunderstanding, and how much they love you. Vanessa will probably even blame her behavior on stress." He handed me one last envelope sealed tight. "This is a letter I want you to read after I'm gone. It contains a few more secrets I discovered, things that will make it very clear who you can trust and who you can't. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but you deserve the truth before you have to make your choices." I took the envelope, which felt as heavy as a lead weight in my hand. As I left the estate that afternoon, driving past Liam's perfectly manicured lawn, I didn't feel like a billionaire. I felt like a man who had finally seen the truth, and it was far more painful than being broke. Driving away from the Thorne estate felt like leaving a different planet and returning to a harsh, gray reality. I had the envelope Elias gave me sitting on the passenger seat, its weight feeling like a lead brick. I didn't open it right away. My mind was already too crowded with the images of my son's house, the perfectly manicured lawn that hid a rotting financial core, and the recording of Vanessa's voice that still echoed in my ears. For the first time in months, I wasn't just tired or sad. I was angry, and strangely enough, that anger felt like fuel. It felt a lot better than the hollowed-out despair I'd been carrying around since Miller Builders collapsed. I didn't go back to the diner parking lot that night. With the $500 Julian Vance had promised me, which he had handed over in an envelope before I left, I drove to a decent, mid-range motel on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't the Ritz, but it had a real bed, a shower with hot water, and a door that locked from the inside. I spent that first night just staring at the ceiling, watching the neon light of the motel sign pulse against the curtains. I kept thinking about Elias's words, "Money changes everything." I wondered if it would change me, or if it would just reveal who I had been all along. The next 5 days passed in a strange kind of limbo. I lived like a man who was already wealthy but hadn't quite realized it yet. I ate my meals at the same diner, but I didn't have to count my change anymore. I spent a lot of time walking through the local park, watching families play and wondering how many of them were built on the same kind of emotional bandwidth, excuses that Liam and Vanessa used. Part of me still expected to wake up and find out the meeting with Elias was some elaborate hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and stress. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a call from a lawyer saying there had been a mistake, that the Arthur Miller they wanted was some other guy. But the call that finally came on Tuesday morning wasn't about a mistake. It was Julian Vance. His voice was even more subdued than usual, carrying a weight of professional grief. Elias Thorne had passed away in the early hours of the morning, exactly 5 days after our meeting. Julian told me the funeral would be a private affair, just the immediate family and a few close business associates. I wasn't invited, which I expected, and honestly, I was relieved. I had already said my goodbyes in that study, surrounded by the smell of old books and the shadow of a life-saving accident from 8 years ago. "The reading of the will is scheduled for Friday morning," Julian said before hanging up. "Mr. Thorne was very specific that you attend. He left additional instructions that can only be carried out in the presence of his children." Friday arrived with a cold, biting wind. I put on the only decent suit I still owned, a navy blue number that was 5 years old and hung a bit loose on my frame since I'd lost weight from the stress of the last few months. It was clean and pressed, though, and it made me feel a little more like the man who used to run Miller Builders and a little less like the man who'd been sleeping in a Ford. The law offices of Peyton, Hayes and Associates were located in a sleek skyscraper downtown. The lobby was all marble and silence, the kind of place where even the air felt expensive. When I stepped out of the elevator on the 20th floor, the receptionist didn't even ask for my name. She just gave me a knowing, somber nod and directed me toward a massive mahogany-paneled conference room. I wasn't the first one there. Sitting at the far end of the table was a man who could only be Elias's son, Richard. He looked about 35, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first 3 trucks combined. He had his father's sharp, piercing eyes, but none of the warmth I'd seen at the end. He was staring at a gold watch on his wrist with an expression of pure boredom. Across from him was his sister, Amanda. She was perfectly put together. Hair, makeup, and jewelry all screaming old money. She didn't even look up from her phone when I walked in. To them, I was just some random gray-haired man in a slightly ill-fitting suit. They didn't know I was about to become the person who stood between them and the hundreds of millions they felt they were owed. The lawyer, James Payton, entered the room a few minutes later. He was the picture of a high-powered attorney. Silver hair, a voice like velvet, and a look that suggested he'd seen every kind of family drama imaginable. He spread several thick folders across the table and adjusted his glasses. "We are here today," Payton began, his voice formal and impersonal, "to read the last will and testament of Harrison Elias Thorne." Richard leaned forward, finally showing a spark of interest. "Can we get to the point? How significant were the changes he made?" Payton looked over his glasses at Richard, a hint of something, maybe pity, in his eyes. "Extremely significant, Mr. Thorne. The previous will, which divided the estate equally between the two of you, has been entirely superseded by a document executed 2 weeks ago." Amanda finally put her phone down, her eyes widening. "What do you mean, superseded?" Payton didn't answer her directly. Instead, he began to read in a measured, rhythmic tone that made the shocking words sound almost like a grocery list. "To my son, Richard," Payton read, "who has spent the last 5 years waiting for my death to settle his gambling debts and fund his wife's shopping habits, I leave the sum of $100,000. Richard's face went from pale to a deep, angry red in a matter of seconds. "What the hell is this?" he hissed. Payton continued as if he hadn't heard the interruption. "To my daughter, Amanda, who has called me exactly 16 times in 5 years, each time to request a wire transfer. I also leave the sum of $100,000. Perhaps this will buy enough designer handbags to fill the void that material things clearly haven't reached yet." Amanda gasped, her hands flying to her throat. "This is insane. He was sick. He wasn't in his right mind." "I assure you," Payton said calmly, "your father underwent 2 separate psychological evaluations before signing this. He was perfectly aware of his decisions." He then turned his gaze toward me, and the room seemed to go dead silent. "The remainder of the estate, valued at approximately $786 million, is left in its entirety to Mr. Arthur James Miller." The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the hum of the city traffic 20 stories below. Both siblings turned their heads toward me slowly, their expressions a mix of horror, confusion, and raw, unadulterated hatred. "Who the hell are you?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Richard Thorne didn't just look angry. He looked like he was about to explode. He slammed his hand onto the mahogany table, the sound echoing through the sterile, expensive air of the conference room. "Who the hell is Arthur Miller?" he demanded again, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and entitlement. He looked at me with such pure, unadulterated venom that I felt like I was back in that freezing creek, bracing for an impact. James Payton, the lawyer, didn't even blink. He'd clearly spent a career dealing with people who thought their last name gave them a right to everything they hadn't earned. He calmly adjusted a sheet of paper in front of him. "According to the documentation provided by your father, Mr. Miller saved his life 8 years ago during a severe automobile accident on Highway 42, Payton explained, his voice as smooth as glass. "The will specifically states that Mr. Miller is the only person who ever showed him genuine kindness without expecting anything in return." Amanda Thorne let out a sharp, jagged laugh. She stood up, her designer jewelry clinking as she gestured wildly toward me. "So what? He did what any decent person would do, and now he thinks he's entitled to our inheritance? This is a joke. He's a stranger." I cleared my throat, the sound feeling loud in the tense silence. "I didn't ask for this," I said quietly, meeting her gaze. "I didn't even know who your father really was until last week." "Oh, please," Richard snapped, leaning across the table until I could smell his expensive cologne, a sharp contrast to the stale, metallic scent of my Ford that still seemed to cling to my skin. "Nobody just hands over nearly $800 million to a guy who helped them out of a ditch once. What was your angle?" How did you manipulate a dying man? Before I could defend myself, Peyton cleared his throat again, a signal that he wasn't finished. There are additional documents your father asked me to distribute, he said, pulling 3 sealed envelopes from a folder. He handed one to me, one to Richard, and one to Amanda. He requested that these be opened and read aloud in the presence of everyone here. I opened mine first. The paper inside was thick, and the handwriting was shaky, clearly written by a man who knew his time was running out. I read the words aloud, my voice steady despite the chaos in the room. Arthur, if you're reading this, then Richard and Amanda have just learned that their years of indifference and greed have finally caught up with them. They're probably calling you a manipulator right now. Don't let them. You earned this inheritance 8 years ago when you risked your life for a stranger. But you've proven you deserve it every day since by living with integrity and kindness, qualities my children never bothered to learn. The room went cold. Richard tore his envelope open with trembling hands, his face turning a shade of scarlet that looked physically painful. As he began to read his own letter, his voice grew tight with rage. It was a list of his sins. Gambling debts totaling over $600,000, cash advances on 17 different credit cards, and the final blow, the fact that he had forged his father's signature on 3 separate occasions to steal funds from accounts he wasn't supposed to touch. Elias had attached the private investigator's report to the letter as proof. Amanda's hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped her letter. Her struggling artist lifestyle was exposed as a lie. She had spent over $400,000 on clothes and cosmetic procedures in just 3 years, while never selling a single painting. Most damning of all, she had been systematically stealing from the household accounts for years. This is harassment, she screamed, crumpling the letter into a ball. This is character assassination. This is the truth, Peyton replied calmly. Your father was very thorough in his documentation. Richard turned his fury back to me. You did this. You poisoned him against us. I met your father exactly once before he died. I reminded him. The truth is, he didn't need me to tell him who you were. He'd been watching you for years. The siblings didn't stay long after that. They left the office in a whirlwind of fury and disbelief, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and bitter words behind them. I stayed for another hour, going through the dizzying technical details of the transfer, the business interests, the properties, the sheer scale of the wealth that was now mine. As I walked back to my car, the afternoon sun felt different on my face. I was no longer a man wondering where he'd sleep. I was a man with the power to change lives. But that realization was interrupted by a familiar buzz in my pocket. I pulled out my phone. The name on the screen made my heart skip a beat. Liam. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello, Liam. Dad? I just heard the news, Liam said, and the tone of his voice was like nothing I'd ever heard from him before. It wasn't the dismissive, hurried voice of a son who had no room for his father. It was calculated. It was eager. Is it true? About the Thorne estate? $700 million. It's true, I said, leaning against my old Ford. Jesus, Dad. That's incredible, he said, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. Listen, Vanessa and I were talking, and we feel absolutely terrible about the other day. We were so stressed out, overwhelmed with work and some family stuff with Vanessa's mom. We said some things we didn't mean. I closed my eyes, remembering the recording Elias had played for me. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were following the script Vanessa had written just 3 days ago, the tough love story they hoped would buy them a way back into my good graces. We'd love to have you over for dinner tomorrow night, Liam continued, his voice dripping with forced warmth, to celebrate the news and to really apologize properly. I looked at the skyscraper behind me, then at my worn-out shoes. 24 hours ago, I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to sit on their couch. Now I was the most important guest they'd ever invited. That's very generous, Liam, I said, my voice carefully neutral. Let me think about it. Of course, take your time, he said quickly. We'll be here whenever you're ready. After I hung up, I didn't go back to the motel. I drove to the cemetery. I sat by my wife's headstone and told her everything. about the car accident, the billionaire's gratitude, and the sudden, miraculous return of our son's emotional bandwidth. I asked her what she would do, but the only answer I got was the rustle of the wind through the oak trees. I knew what I had to do. I reached into my jacket and felt the other envelope Elias had given me, the one with the surveillance and the transcripts. I was going to that dinner, but I wasn't going as a victim. I was going as a man who finally knew the price of every person in that room. I spent most of Wednesday afternoon sitting in my motel room, staring at the 2 cashier's checks I had picked up from the bank. Each one was made out for $25,000. To the man I was a week ago, the man counting pennies for a burger, this was a life-changing sum. But in the grand scheme of the $786 million I now controlled, it was a rounding error. I wasn't giving them this money because I felt generous. I was giving it as a test. I wanted to see if they could look me in the eye and lie while holding a piece of my new life in their hands. Before heading to Liam's house, I stopped at a local liquor store. I walked past the locked cases of vintage French wines and the $100 bottles of champagne. Instead, I picked out a mid-shelf bottle of Merlot, the kind that costs about $15 and is perfectly fine but certainly isn't a celebration wine. I wanted to see if they'd notice. I wanted to see if the people who now valued me at nearly $1 billion would be disappointed by a $15 gesture. I arrived at Liam's house at exactly 7 p.m. As I pulled my battered Ford into the driveway, I noticed that the lawn looked even more pristine than usual, if that was even possible. Every hedge was trimmed to a mathematical certainty. The porch lights were on, casting a warm, inviting glow that felt entirely fraudulent. Just a few days ago, the same driveway felt like a gauntlet I had to run. Now it felt like a stage set for a very bad play. Vanessa answered the door before I could even take my finger off the doorbell. She was wearing a silk dress I'd never seen before. Something elegant and dark that probably cost more than my old truck was worth in its final days. The look on her face wasn't the disgust I'd seen last time. It was a radiant, practiced joy. "Arthur," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around me in a hug that lasted just a few seconds too long to be genuine. "We are so happy you could make it. We've been talking about nothing else all day." I stepped inside, and the change in the house was immediate. It was cleaner, more organized, and smelled faintly of expensive lavender candles. The dining room table, visible from the foyer, was set with their good china, the stuff they usually only pulled out for Vanessa's parents or high-end work functions. It was a far cry from the emotional bandwidth conversation on the porch. Back then, I wasn't even worth a glass of water. Tonight, I was the guest of honor. Liam appeared from the kitchen, wearing a cashmere sweater and a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dad, come on in. Let me get that coat for you." He took my jacket with a level of care usually reserved for fragile antiques. "Can I get you a drink?" I went out and got that Highland Scotch you used to talk about. I'd never actually expressed a preference for that particular Scotch, but I didn't correct him. "Just water for now, Liam," I said, watching him deflate just a tiny bit. They guided me into the living room, where we sat on their expensive leather furniture. For a few minutes, the air was thick with a clumsy, awkward silence. They kept glancing at each other, engaging in that silent, married couple communication where they try to decide who should go first. "So," Liam finally said, his voice carefully casual, "this inheritance thing, Julian Vance called me. It's all true? The 700 million? "It's true," I replied, taking a sip of the water Liam had handed me. Vanessa leaned forward, her expression shifting into one of intense, focused earnestness. "Arthur, before we even think about dinner, Liam and I need to say something. We need to apologize for how we handled things the other day. We feel sick about it. We were just so stressed," Liam added quickly, leaning in as if to share a deep secret. "Between my job being on the line and Vanessa's mom having those health scares, we weren't in our right minds. We were overwhelmed." I watched them closely. They looked so sincere. If I hadn't heard the recording Elias played for me, the one where Vanessa planned exactly how to handle this reconciliation, I might have actually believed them. "The truth is," Vanessa said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We were actually trying to protect you. We know how proud you are, Arthur. How independent you've always been. We thought if we offered to help you right away, you'd feel like a charity case. You'd feel diminished." "It was tough love," Liam said, using the exact phrase I'd heard on the recording. "We wanted to give you a few days to find your own footing because we believed in you. We knew you were a fighter." It was a masterclass in gaslighting. They were trying to convince me that leaving me to sleep in my car in a McDonald's parking lot was actually a tribute to my character. "That's a very interesting way of looking at it," I said, my voice as flat as the water in my glass. Vanessa didn't seem to notice the coldness in my tone. She brightened up instantly, sensing that her explanation had been accepted. "Well, we're just so glad it's behind us. Family is the most important thing, after all. We never want you to doubt that we love you. Family is everything." I agreed, and for the first time that night, I saw them both relax visibly. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was back in their pocket. "So, tell us about this Mr. Thorne," Vanessa said, shifting gears into curious investigator mode. "What was he like? How did a 1-hour meeting turn into all of this?" I spent the next 20 minutes giving them a sanitized version of the story. I told them about the accident, about pulling Elias from the water, and how he had spent his life feeling he owed me a debt. I watched their faces as I spoke. Every time I mentioned a detail of Elias's wealth or the properties he owned, Vanessa's eyes would light up with a hungry, predatory glint. "It's like something out of a movie," she gushed as we moved into the dining room. The hero finally getting his just reward. The dinner was elaborate: prime rib, roasted vegetables, and a wine that definitely cost more than the bottle I'd brought. They were laying it on thick. Throughout the meal, Vanessa kept steering the conversation toward the future. "Philanthropy is so important when you have means," she said, cutting into her beef with practiced grace. "I've been working with a few local charities focused on children's literacy. It's a way of giving back, of making a real difference. We could help you set something up, Arthur. I have so many connections in the nonprofit world." "I'm sure you do," I said. After the meal, we moved back to the living room for coffee. Vanessa disappeared for a moment and returned with a heavy leather-bound book. "I was going through some old pictures today," she said, sitting down next to me and opening the photo album. "Look at this one. From the wedding." She turned the pages, showing me pictures of Michael's graduation, of family holidays, and of my late wife, Margaret. It was an emotional ambush. She was trying to remind me of the good times, trying to use my grief and my love for my son to cement the bond they were trying to rebuild. "I know we haven't been as close as we should be," Liam said, sitting on my other side. "Life gets busy, but at the end of the day, we're family. That's what matters." Vanessa closed the album and looked at me with tears shimmering in her eyes. "I hope you can forgive us, Arthur, for not being there the way we should have been. We want to do better. We want to be a real family again." I looked from her to Liam. They looked perfect. They looked like the children any father would be proud of. And I knew that in their pockets they were already spending the money they thought I was about to give them. "I appreciate that," I said, reaching into my jacket. "I really do. And because I want to help us get back on the right foot, I have something for you." I pulled out the 2 envelopes containing the $25,000 checks and set them on the coffee table. Their eyes locked onto the white paper like sharks smelling blood in the water. The silence in the room was heavy, almost physical, as Liam and Vanessa stared at the 2 white envelopes resting on the coffee table. I could see the pulse thrumming in Liam's neck, and Vanessa's fingers twitched, clearly itching to reach out and see exactly how many zeros were on those checks. They looked like 2 people who had just won the lottery but were trying to act like they didn't care about the money. "Dad, what's this?" Liam asked, his voice hushed and thick with a forced kind of humility. "It's a gift," I said, leaning back and watching them with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. "From someone who finally understands what it's like to be truly struggling. I know what it's like to look at a bank account and see nothing but red. I know what it's like to wonder if the roof over your head is going to be there next month. Vanessa gave a little tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Struggling? Arthur, we're not struggling. Things are a bit tight because of the economy. Sure, but we're doing just fine. I didn't say a word. I just reached into the side pocket of my old suit and pulled out the thick manila folder Elias Thorne had given me, the one with the surveillance reports and the financial audits. I set it right next to the checks. The contrast was stark. The white envelopes represented the lie they wanted to live, and the tan folder represented the truth they were hiding. Actually, I said, my voice dropping into the professional, no-nonsense tone I used to use when a subcontractor tried to overcharge me on a job site. You aren't doing fine at all. You're $43,000 deep in credit card debt. You're 3 months behind on your mortgage payments, and the bank is already starting the paperwork for a foreclosure. The color drained from Vanessa's face so fast it was like someone had pulled a plug. She went from radiant to ghostly in a heartbeat. Liam looked like he'd been punched in the solar plexus. He slumped back into the leather sofa, the cashmere of his sweater suddenly looking like a costume that didn't fit anymore. How do you know that? Liam whispered, his eyes darting to the folder. The same way I know about the conversation you two had 3 days ago, I said, and I pulled out the small digital recorder Elias had provided. The one where you sat right here in this living room and planned exactly how to handle me. The one where you decided to use the phrase tough love to explain away the fact that you left me to sleep in my car. I pressed play. The room was suddenly filled with Vanessa's voice, but it wasn't the sweet, inviting tone she'd used all night. It was cold, clinical, and manipulative. We need a story that explains our behavior without making us look bad. Her recorded voice echoed off the walls. Asterisk, he'll want to buy it. Nobody wants to believe their family doesn't care about them. Give people a face-saving explanation and they'll usually take it star. Then came Liam's voice, sounding small and uncertain. Asterisk, you think he'll buy that? Star. And Vanessa's reply, asterisk, we were protecting him. We knew he was proud. It was tough love, star. I turned the recorder off. The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air. Liam wouldn't even look at me. He was staring at the perfectly polished hardwood floor, his shoulders shaking slightly. I also know, I continued, my heart feeling like a cold stone in my chest, that you told Vanessa I was too much of a burden to help, that you didn't have the emotional bandwidth for your own father. Arthur, I can explain. Vanessa finally managed to choke out. Her eyes welled with tears that I finally realized were for herself, not for me. We were so scared about the money. We didn't want you to know how bad things were. We thought if we let you stay, you'd see the truth, and we were embarrassed. You don't need to explain, I said, standing up. The fine china and the expensive wine suddenly felt repulsive. I understand perfectly. You didn't turn me away because you were embarrassed. You turned me away because, in your eyes, I was a failure, a burden, someone whose problems were too inconvenient to fit into the perfect life you were pretending to have. I buttoned my jacket, feeling the weight of the billions I now commanded, but also the weight of the 35 years I'd spent building a relationship that turned out to be hollow. You probably hoped I'd just vanish, so you wouldn't have to feel guilty every time you looked at your underwater mortgage. Dad, that's not fair, Liam said, finally looking up. There was a desperation in his eyes that was painful to see. We love you. We've always loved you. No, Liam, I said quietly, looking my son in the eye. You love what I can give you. You love the idea of a father who pays for the wedding and cosigns the loans. But the moment I needed you to pay it back, not with money, but with a place to sleep and a bit of kindness, you chose her opinion over my welfare. I gestured to the 2 envelopes on the table. The checks are yours to keep. Consider them payment for a very valuable lesson. What lesson? Vanessa asked, her voice small and trembling. The lesson that your father isn't stupid, I said, and that sometimes karma takes a while to show up, but it always collects its debt. You spent years trying to make me feel small so you could feel big. Now you have $50,000 to catch up on your bills. But you've lost the only person who would have helped you for free. Liam stood up, reaching out as if to grab my arm, panic flaring in his expression. Dad, wait. Don't leave like this. We can work this out. We can go to counseling, we can start over. There's nothing to work out, Liam, I said, walking toward the front door. You made your choice on that porch when you told me to find a motel. I'm just making mine now. But we're family, Vanessa cried out, the tears now streaming down her face. Family forgives each other. I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. You're right. Family does forgive. But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to pretend this dinner was real. And it certainly doesn't mean I have to keep putting myself in a position to be hurt by people who only value me when my bank account is full. What are you saying? Liam asked, his voice cracking. I'm saying goodbye, I said, and I walked out into the cool night air. As I drove down the driveway, I saw them through the living room window. They weren't hugging or comforting each other. They were both sitting on opposite ends of the sofa, staring at the two envelopes on the coffee table. The perfect house was still there, the lawn was still manicured, and the lights were still warm. But for the first time I could see it for what it really was, a beautiful, expensive cage. I drove toward the lake, where a small cottage I'd been looking at was for sale. I didn't need 20,000 square feet or a staff of butlers. I just needed a place where the foundation was solid. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly how to build one that wouldn't crack. The transition from a cramped Ford sedan to the master of an $800 million estate didn't happen with a flash of light or a choir of angels. It happened in quiet, sterile offices, through the scratching of expensive pens on thick parchment, and in the respectful nods of men in suits who suddenly looked at me like I was made of gold. After that final, hollow dinner at Liam's house, I spent a few weeks in a strange, hyper-real haze. The inheritance was finalized without much of a fight. Richard and Amanda Thorne's lawyers had apparently taken one look at the psychological evaluations and the pile of evidence Elias had gathered on their behavior and told them they were better off taking their $100,000 and walking away. Fighting a man with a $700 million legal budget when you're already in debt is a quick way to end up with nothing at all. I didn't move into Elias's 20,000 square foot fortress. It was a magnificent place, a monument to a man's second chance, but it wasn't my home. It felt like a museum dedicated to a life I hadn't lived. Instead, I used a tiny fraction of the funds to buy a house I'd seen on the edge of a quiet lake about 40 miles outside the city. It was a sturdy, well-built home with a wraparound porch and windows that looked out over the water. It was the kind of place I used to dream of building back when Miller Builders was just a dream and a toolbox. The day I moved in, I didn't hire a massive crew of movers. I didn't have much to move anyway, just a few new suits, some books, and the single suitcase I'd carried to Liam's porch. I remember sitting on that new porch as the sun began to dip behind the trees, the water of the lake turning to liquid orange and gold. For the first time in years, the weight in my chest was gone. I paid for the house in cash. No mortgage, no bank to answer to, no spreadsheets in the red. It was mine in a way that nothing had ever been mine before. But being wealthy wasn't just about the house. I had inherited Elias's businesses, too. Thorne Industries was a massive machine with thousands of employees and interests across the globe. I spent the first month visiting offices, meeting with managers, and trying to understand the legacy Elias had left me. I wasn't a corporate shark, and I didn't pretend to be. I kept the people Elias had trusted, the good ones, the ones who had stayed loyal even when he was dying, and I let them do what they did best. I just sat at the head of the table and made sure the foundation stayed solid. I'd heard through the grapevine, business associates of Elias who still kept tabs on the local gossip, that Liam and Vanessa had used the $50,000 I gave them to stop the foreclosure on their house. They were caught up for now. But a house built on debt and lies is never truly safe. The checks had bought them time, but they hadn't bought them a change of heart. My phone, which used to stay silent for days at a time, was now a constant source of noise. Liam called twice a week. He never left long messages, just short, hesitant voicemails. Asterisk, hey Dad, just checking in. Hope the new place is good. Give us a call when you can. Asterisk, Vanessa sent a card for every minor holiday, filled with long, flowery paragraphs about how much they missed the old days, and how the house felt empty without me. I didn't block them. I didn't yell or send angry letters. I just didn't engage. I'd learned a hard lesson on that porch and an even harder one at that dinner table. When someone shows you who they are when you have nothing, you have to believe them. To Liam and Vanessa, I was a burden when I was broke and a jackpot now that I was rich. Neither of those versions of me was the father Liam should have loved. I found that the most surprising thing about having money was the silence it brought. It silenced the anxiety of the 3 a.m. "How will I pay for this?" thoughts. It silenced the fear of the future. But it also created a space where I could finally hear my own voice again. I started spending my mornings at a small diner in my new town, not out of necessity this time, but out of habit. The waitress there, a woman named Clara who had worked there for 20 years, didn't know I owned a global empire. To her, I was just Arthur, the guy who liked his coffee black and his eggs over easy. One morning, while I was reading the paper, a news story caught my eye. It was a small piece about a local shelter for veterans that was facing closure due to a lack of funding. I thought about the night I spent in my Ford, the cold dampness of the air, and the feeling of being invisible to the world. I didn't call a press conference. I didn't put my name on a building. I just called James Payton and told him to handle it. A week later, the shelter had an anonymous endowment that would keep its doors open for 50 years. I realized then that Elias had given me more than money. He had given me the ability to be the person I always wanted to be, the man who helps because he can, not because he wants a reward. I wasn't the disappointing father anymore. I wasn't the failed contractor. I was just a man with a second chance, much like Elias had been after he was pulled from that creek. I started taking long walks along the lake, watching the seasons change. The anger I'd felt after that dinner was slowly being replaced by a quiet, steady peace. Anger takes a lot of energy, a lot of emotional bandwidth. And I decided I wasn't going to waste mine on people who only saw me as a means to an end. One Saturday, a black SUV pulled into my driveway. I was out on the porch, sanding down an old wooden chair I'd found at a garage sale, one of the simple pleasures I'd rediscovered. For a moment, my heart tightened. I thought it might be Liam, coming to try one last time to work things out. But it wasn't Liam. It was Julian Vance. He looked slightly less formal in a light gray suit, carrying a small wooden box. "Mr. Miller," he said, stepping onto the porch. "I apologize for the intrusion. I was clearing out Mr. Thorne's private safe at the office, and I found something he wanted you to have." He was very clear that it shouldn't be delivered until you were settled. He handed me the box. It was heavy, made of dark cherry wood. I opened it and found a pair of old silver-plated cufflinks and a small, weathered leather-bound notebook. I flipped through the pages and saw Elias's handwriting. Not the shaky script from his final days, but a strong, vibrant hand from years ago. It was a journal of his early days in business, full of the mistakes he'd made, the people he'd lost, and the lessons he'd learned about what really matters. "Thank you, Julian," I said, looking at the notebook. "He spoke of you often at the end, sir," Julian said, his voice softening. "He told me that saving his life was the smallest thing you did for him, showing him that a man could still be kind when he had every reason to be bitter. That was the real gift." After Julian left, I sat in my chair and watched the ripples on the water. I thought about the man I was 35 years ago, the man I was in that McDonald's parking lot, and the man I was now. I wasn't sure what the next chapter would hold, but for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't afraid to turn the page. I had my house, I had my peace, and I had the truth. By the time 6 months had passed, the rhythm of my new life had settled into a steady, peaceful hum. I was no longer waking up in a cold sweat, reaching for a steering wheel that wasn't there, or checking my pockets to see if I had enough change for a cup of coffee. I was sitting on the porch of my lake house, watching the morning mist roll off the water like a soft, white blanket being pulled back to reveal the day. It wasn't a sprawling mansion like the Thorne estate, but it was solid, it was quiet, and most importantly, it was completely mine. The inheritance process had been long and filled with enough paperwork to fill a small library. But it was finally finished without any more drama from Elias's children. Richard and Amanda had vanished into the background of the city, likely nursing their wounds and trying to figure out how to stretch $100,000 into a lifetime. I didn't hold any ill will toward them. They were just products of a man who hadn't known how to be a father until it was almost too late. As for Thorn Industries, I had decided early on that I wouldn't try to be something I wasn't. I wasn't a corporate shark in a three-piece suit. I was a guy who knew how to build things from the ground up. I kept the managers Elias had trusted, but I also promoted some of the boots-on-the-ground people, the ones who actually understood how the machines worked and how the products were made. Once a week, Julian Vance would drive out to the lake with a briefcase full of documents for me to sign, and we'd sit on the porch, talking about the business and the man who had started it all. I'd also heard through various channels that Liam and Vanessa had managed to stay in their house. The $25,000 I gave each of them had been enough to clear their immediate debts and keep the bank at bay. I wondered if they were actually changing their habits, or if they were just holding their breath, waiting for me to cave in and send more. Liam still called. Every few weeks, my phone would buzz, and I'd see his name. I'd listen to the voicemails later, always the same hesitant tone, always asking how I was doing but never quite apologizing for the real hurt. Then there were the cards. Vanessa was a master of the handwritten note. For every holiday, and even some that weren't really holidays, an envelope would arrive in my mailbox. At Christmas, she sent a card with a long letter tucked inside, full of news about their lives, their neighbors, and how much they longed for a family reunion. I read them and then I put them in a drawer. I hadn't blocked their numbers or burned the cards, but I hadn't replied, either. I was practicing a kind of emotional architecture. I was building a wall not out of spite but for my own protection. As I had learned from a wise quote once, when someone shows you who they truly are, you have to believe them the first time. I wasn't lonely, though. In my new town, I had started to make real friends. People who didn't know a thing about my net worth or the Thorn name. There was a retired teacher named Ben and a local mechanic named Gus. We'd meet up for poker games or barbecues, and the conversation was never about investments or emotional bandwidth. They liked me because I could tell a good story and I knew how to fix a leaky faucet, and that was enough for me. It was a relief to be valued for my company rather than my bank account. But the most important part of my week wasn't the poker games or the business meetings. It was the time I spent at a local shelter for veterans. It was a small, underfunded place tucked away on a side street, full of men who had seen the worst the world had to offer and had come home to find they no longer fit into the lives they'd left behind. Many of them reminded me of myself during those dark weeks after Miller Builders collapsed. Men who had lost everything and felt like they were invisible to the world. I didn't go there as Mr. Miller, the billionaire. I went there as Arthur, a guy who had spent a few nights in his car and knew what it felt like to be hungry and ignored. I'd spend hours just listening to them, hearing their stories of service and their struggles with the civilian world. I helped them fill out paperwork, navigate the bureaucracy of the VA, and sometimes I'd just sit and play checkers with them. I realized that being genuinely wealthy wasn't about the balance in my checking account. It was about the freedom to choose who I spent my time with and who I could lift up. It was about never having to compromise my values again just because I needed something from someone. One afternoon, a younger veteran named Jax approached me. He'd been living at the shelter for a month, struggling to find a job that would hire someone with a gap in their resume. "Arthur," he said, looking at his boots, "I saw you talking to the director about the new roof. You seem to know a lot about construction." "I spent 35 years in the trade, Jax," I told him. "It's the only thing I know how to do better than making a bad cup of coffee." Do you think someone like me could learn?" he asked. "I'm good with my hands, but I don't have a license or tools." I looked at him, the same look of quiet desperation I'd seen in my own mirror. "I tell you what," I said. "I know a firm that's looking for apprentices. They don't care about gaps in resumes. They care about people who show up on time and want to learn how to build things right. I'll make a call." I didn't tell him I owned the firm. I just made the call to one of my managers at Thorn Industries construction division. 2 days later, Jax had a job, a set of new tools, and a reason to look up when he walked down the street. That feeling, the feeling of watching a man's foundation start to settle and hold, was worth more to me than any dividend check I'd ever received. As the months rolled on, I realized that Elias Thorne hadn't just given me an inheritance. He had given me a mission. He had been running away from his life when I pulled him from that creek 8 years ago. He'd been scared, panicked, and ready to abandon everything. But in the end, he had run toward something better. He'd used his second chance to make sure I had one too. I still kept Margaret's picture on the table by my favorite chair. Every night, I'd raise a glass of wine toward her and tell her about the day. "We did okay, Maggie," I'd whisper to the photo. "We raised a son who, well, he followed a path we didn't expect, but he's making his way. And I'm doing okay, too." The evening air at the lake was always soft, filled with the sound of crickets and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Sometimes, I'd hear the sound of a family barbecue from across the water, the laughter and the shouts of kids playing, and it didn't make me sad anymore. It was the sound of real family, the kind you create with honesty and time, not the kind you're forced into by blood or obligation. I was 77 years old in spirit, if not in years, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt completely at peace. I had settled my debts, I had found my purpose, and I was finally living in a house built on a foundation of truth. 6 months have passed since that life-altering Friday in the lawyer's office, and today, I'm sitting on the porch of my new house, watching the sun dip low over the lake. It's not a sprawling estate like the one Elias Thorne owned, but it's exactly what I needed. A sturdy, honest home with a foundation that I inspected myself. I paid for it in cash with no mortgage, no debt, and no one who has the power to take it away from me. It's a strange feeling, after years of building homes for others, to finally be sitting in one that is truly irrevocably mine. The transition from a man with $7.38 in his pocket to the owner of a multimillion-dollar estate happened quickly, but the mental shift has taken longer. The inheritance was finalized without any further legal battles. Richard and Amanda Thorne seemingly realized that fighting over $100,000 wasn't worth the legal fees it would take to challenge me. I've kept Elias's businesses running, though I was careful to hire good, honest people to manage the technical sides of the industries that I didn't fully understand myself. I'm still a builder at heart, and I find that I'm much better at overseeing the construction of a legacy than I am at staring at stock tickers all day. I've heard through the grapevine, mutual acquaintances who still live in the city, that Liam and Vanessa used the $50,000 I gave them to catch up on their mortgage payments. They're still in that colonial house in the suburbs, still maintaining the facade of a perfect life, though I suspect the cracks are still there, just hidden under a fresh coat of paint. Liam has called a few more times, leaving voicemails that I still haven't returned. Vanessa sent a card at Christmas, filled with more flowery words about family bonds and new beginnings. I haven't blocked their numbers, and I haven't cut them off with a letter of fire and brimstone. I just haven't engaged. The truth is, I'm not angry anymore. I realize that anger requires a massive amount of emotional investment, and I've decided to stop investing in people who saw me as a means to an end rather than a person worth loving. When someone shows you who they really are, you have to believe them the first time, and they showed me their hearts on that porch and at that dinner table. I forgive them, but forgiveness doesn't mean I have to invite them back into my life to hurt me again. Instead, I've made new friends here in my new town. They know me as Arthur, the guy who likes to fish and knows how to fix a porch swing, not as the disappointing father or the failed contractor. They invite me to barbecues and poker games, and they don't expect anything from me except my company and maybe a good story or two. It's a simple, honest kind of friendship that I didn't realize I was missing. I've also started spending my time volunteering at a local shelter for veterans. There are so many men there who remind me of the man I was not too long ago. Men who lost everything through circumstances they couldn't control and who just need someone to see them as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Helping them navigate their own cracked foundations has given me a sense of purpose that no amount of money could ever buy. I've learned that being genuinely wealthy isn't about the number of zeros in a bank account. It's about the freedom to choose who you spend your time with. It's about being able to help someone like Jax without needing a thank you note. It's about never having to compromise your values or accept poor treatment just because you're afraid of where you'll sleep tomorrow. As the evening air grows soft and warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, I think about Elias Thorne. I think about that rainy night on Highway 42 and how he was running away from his problems when I pulled him from that sinking car. In a way, he spent the rest of his life running toward this moment, toward the chance to give someone else the freedom he struggled so hard to find for himself. He settled his debt, and in doing so, he allowed me to settle mine. Margaret's photograph sits on the table beside my chair, and I raise my glass of wine toward her. "We did okay, Maggie," I say to the picture. "We raised a son who, well, he is who he chose to be. And that's not our fault." Somewhere in the distance, I can hear a family having a barbecue, their laughter carrying across the water. It's the sound of people who actually enjoy being together, who choose each other's company without feeling obligated by guilt or greed. It's the sound of real family, the kind you create with your own hands and your own heart. I close my eyes and listen to the laughter, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I feel completely at peace. I hope you enjoyed my story. It has been quite a journey from that McDonald's parking lot to this porch. I truly wonder, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have chosen to stay silent just to keep the peace with your family? Or would you have done what I did to reclaim your dignity and stand up for the truth? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I'm reading every single one. Let me know which city you're listening from tonight. If my story resonated with you, your support means the world to me and helps me bring more chapters like this to the world. Don't forget to check out the other stories on the screen now, and click that notification bell so you never miss a new journey. Thank you for being here with me until the very end. Until the next story, I wish you love, respect, and a foundation that never cracks.